Hey team, today we're going to talk about e-commerce, WordPress, WPGraphQL, and how it's able to make sense in today's development world. I'm Colby Fayok, and if you want to learn more about how to manage your product data with WordPress, and be sure to check out my course on Level Up Tutorials, e-commerce on the Jamstack. Today, we have a special guest. We have the creator of WPGraphQL, who's also a software engineer at WP Engine. We have Jason Bahl. Jason, come on down. Hey, what's
Hello.
up? Do you want to give yourself a quick introduction?
Yeah, my name's Jason Bahl, like you said. Also, like you said, I'm a software engineer at WP Engine. Started WP GraphQL in, 2016 or Thanksgiving week.
Wow.
We kind of had an idea. I was working in a newspaper at the time and had an idea to solve some problems we had in-house with syndicating content, and started as kind of just a small project to pitch to my team there, and then I convinced them that we should use it, and so we started building it to solve problems we had there at the newspaper, and then I continued working on it as a community project, and here we are.
That's awesome. Well, everybody, welcome to the stream, and if you have any questions, please be sure to ask them in the chat. We'll get to them either throughout the stream if it's relevant to the questions, or we'll get to it at the end in a Q&A. So let's jump into it. So starting off, I'm sure most of the web knows what it is, but let's just talk quickly, like a high level, about what WordPress is.
Yeah, so WordPress is a content management system, so it's all web-based. So when a WordPress install is set up, users can log into it and they get a dashboard that they can then publish content to, upload media such as images or videos, and then associate that media to blog posts or pages or other types of content. And you can register whatever types of content you want. Like if you're building a real estate site, you could have houses. If you're building, a bakery, you could have types of bread, or like whatever you can imagine. You can make WordPress work for whatever content you need to manage. And it's fully open source. It's free. As in, there is cost typically associated with it, to host or to purchase, plugins to make things work certain ways. But the core of it is free to download and use however you want. And runs 40-something% of the web today. So
it's amazing. The numbers are staggering. Like I have a talk where I always introduce that, and it's just mind-boggling how big of a chunk of the internet that WordPress is.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's been growing. You would think at this point it would have slowed the growth, but it seems like it's growing faster than ever.
Yeah, it's crazy. But I think some of those are pretty compelling solutions. And just the fact that WordPress has been around forever means that there's just already so much community built around it. Like there's so many tools. What do you think, though? What do you think are some of the challenges of WordPress in modern web development? Like I know particularly with me, I do a lot of work with the Jamstack and stuff. So WordPress is kind of like, sitting on the side there. What do you find with some of the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, so WordPress is fully PHP based, which means like PHP gets the data from the database and then builds the pages, and that works well for a lot of people. I would even argue you can consider modern PHP modern development too, but I think the word modern development is usually equates JavaScript. And so yeah, you typically when you're building JavaScript front ends, or even like Swift or whatever for mobile applications, typically you don't have direct access to the server, so you typically will need to communicate over API and get your data. And so WordPress was not built with that as a first class use case. So, the assumption was that you'd be writing everything in PHP, rendering the page with PHP. Now with JavaScript, Jamstack, like you said, or even mobile applications, you need to get the data outside of PHP, typically with JavaScript or something. And so WP GraphQL, WordPress in, I think also 2016 added the WordPress REST API to WordPress core, which allows you to get data over JSON via endpoints. And then WPGraphQL also allows you to get data using GraphQL queries, and you get data back as JSON. So then you can use WordPress data in other contexts like a Jamstack site or a native mobile app. But some of the challenges, like I mentioned, WordPress wasn't designed for this use case. So there's some things that are difficult, right? Because the assumption is that you will be using PHP to work with WordPress. And so, but WP GraphQL, I've solved a lot of problems that, 5 years ago were extremely difficult. So it's now you can get lists of posts, and you can create posts, and you can delete posts, you can do mutations, you can query data, all sorts of stuff, all using JSON and GraphQL. But yeah, there's still problems like extensions would be one. Like if you install a WordPress plugin, it may or may not work with WP GraphQL depending on the scope of the plugin. It can work. Anything that can work with WordPress, you can get to work with WP GraphQL. It might not work out of the box.
Fair enough, yeah.
But there's a WP GraphQL is fully extendable, so you can if your plugin that you need data from doesn't work out of the box, you can register fields to the schema and pull that data out however you need it for your project. But yeah, that's
and that's interesting. I didn't realize that the REST API came out around the same time as WP GraphQL. Did you know? Was that on your radar at all when you were? Thinking about?
Yeah, we were using WP GraphQL exists because I was a very heavy user of the REST API.
Okay.
So the REST API was a WordPress plugin for a number of years before it made it into WordPress core. And so we were using it at the newspaper to do content syndication for a few years, even before it was in WordPress core. And so I'd followed that for a long time, and I used it very heavily, pushed it to its limits. It got very difficult to keep working with. And so we needed to explore something else to keep our sites working. And yeah, so the birth of WP GraphQL came out of pain points of using the REST API in production.
Do you mind sharing some of those pain points? Because I think a lot of people, GraphQL is still relatively new, right? Considering like how long REST APIs have been around. Like what are some of the challenges of REST APIs that you might hit?
Yeah, so for us specifically, I think this is common with a lot of REST APIs. But for us specifically, we were doing content syndication we had a network of like 54 WordPress sites. They're all newspapers all across the United States.
Oh, wow.
And we did a lot of content syndication. So let's say I'm in Denver. Let's say Denver Broncos win the Super Bowl. Probably not going to happen this year, but let's say it happens. They publish a story. Denver Post publishes a story. Well, that's kind of national news, right? So instead of a journalist at every paper writing a story about it, this journalist publishes it, and all papers that are subscribed to the Denver Broncos topic will get a copy of that sent over. And then they have the option to localize it as well. Like customize captions on an image or swap out an image or whatever. Like it's an actual local copy on that newspaper site. It's not
interesting.
It's not like an iframe or something like that.
Right.
And so we would be sending a lot of stuff over the wire. And so with using REST, there's every object has its own endpoint. So when you syndicate a blog post or a newspaper article, you're not just syndicating one object. You're syndicating the article, and then each image has a different object, and then the tags or categories or taxonomy terms as different objects, and then the author has a different object, and then like all sorts of data. So instead of just like one thing, you have all these HTTP requests in REST to get the post, to get the taxonomy term, to get the author, to get where GraphQL comes in. We can simplify that and create singular requests that have nested resources. So it solves one technical problem of a lot less network back and forth. Instead of having to syndicate a post, then do a callback to get the tag, and then a callback to get the author, and then yada, yada, yada. We can do a lot of stuff in one request. So technically it sped up the movement of data, but it also solved problems for the developer team to build a scalable code base. With REST, everything is implicit. So if you're reading code that somebody wrote that's using REST, you see it hits an endpoint, and then you don't really know what they wanted from that endpoint when they wrote the code. With GraphQL, everything is explicit. You write down to the field what you want to get back from the API. And so 6 months down the road, if something's not working, you can read the GraphQL query and say, okay, I know what they were hoping to get at the time they wrote this code. If it's not working today, it's a lot easier for me to troubleshoot versus if I saw a REST endpoint that maybe last month it returned 1,000 fields and today it returns 800 fields. Oh, shoot. Right. Like now I have to like somehow figure out what changed on that system, and it can be very difficult. So GraphQL, the explicit nature of GraphQL solved a lot of developer process issues, and then obviously the performance issues. So there's a couple of things we were trying to solve with it.
Yeah, and I think a couple of points there are interesting, like especially the selecting the fields that you want to grab. And you mentioned things about like the network time that you're spending with the single request, but you're also getting by getting far less data, that's also helping the performance because you're not having to get like potentially megabytes of for thousands of posts. Like you're getting that limited data set, which can really make a big difference depending how much data is in there.
Yeah, for sure. And also, I do have there's a talk on WordPress.tv. I believe you can find it. I've done talks. You can just search my name on WordPress.tv, and I've got some WordCamp talks on there where I talk about some of these problems in more detail.
Nice. That's awesome. And also, the other interesting part was so the fact that you're talking about syndication with newspapers and stuff, like that seems like a big problem that maybe not everybody has, but if you think about it, that's the same kind of thing that somebody might be dealing with even just with a personal blog, because you're still having to deal with like the authors and the different data endpoints. And that's kind of one of the reasons I started getting into it, because I started poking around with the Jamstack and REST API, and having to chain all those requests together just became a nightmare to maintain.
I think pretty much anything that is dealing with data has these relational data problems, so.
Yeah. And I want to talk a bit how that also relates to kind of like e-commerce and product data. And I know like WP GraphQL isn't like primarily an e-com product or anything like that, but how do you think that helps things like being able to query product data, for instance, where it's, it's not blog posts, but it does have its relationships, right?
Yeah. So, so there is an extension WP GraphQL for WooCommerce. So WooCommerce is a WordPress plugin, free with, then there's paid extension ecosystem around it too. I believe at the moment it's the most widely used e-commerce tool in the world right now. More sites run on WooCommerce, more e-commerce sites run on WooCommerce than anything else. But anyway, so there's an extension that bridges WooCommerce with WP GraphQL. So if you're running WooCommerce and then WP GraphQL for WooCommerce, you can query product data from WooCommerce using WP GraphQL. I believe your course, if I'm not mistaken, uses a separate e-commerce solution. So you're kind of merging two systems together using WordPress for blog data. And then, if I'm not mistaken, it was Snipcart for your e-commerce data. So you can store some data in WordPress, get it through WP GraphQL, and then reference objects in other systems like Snipcart and get the data that way. So basically, I would say e-commerce doesn't really matter what kind of data you're using. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're building a real estate site and want houses, or a car site and want cars, or products and want products, right? Like you can connect that all up in WP GraphQL. You can query the data back and get what you need. And then, like I mentioned, there is mutations. So this is where e-commerce, maybe it does make a difference for e-commerce, because you will have mutations or changes that users need to make back to the system, such as placing orders, adding to the cart, things like that. So WP GraphQL for WooCommerce ships with some of that functionality. I don't maintain that plugin, by the way. Jeff Taylor maintains that extension. But that ships with some stuff like add to cart mutations that handle some of the like storing of cart data in a session that the server and the client can both know about. So you can use GraphQL mutations to add products to cart, and then get that data back, and then you can do things like calculate taxes and things like that, which is not necessarily trivial to do. So
yeah. I was curious how that part worked because I wasn't sure if you just kind of like pushed somebody from the UI. I'm not sure if you ever used Stripe Checkout, but I wasn't sure if you pushed somebody to the WooCommerce UI from the application. But it seems like you can do the entire thing.
Yeah, I think there are definitely sites that are doing that too, that do the whole kind of checkout process, and then when you're ready to actually pay, it does. I've seen, I think Rudis.com, RUDIS.com. That's it's a Gatsby site with WooCommerce on the back end, WP GraphQL, and so the whole add to cart and everything, all the product listing pages, that's all through WP GraphQL. The final actual pay page does go back to a PHP rendered WordPress page. But that's one of the cool things is like the WP GraphQL is sharing data between the client and the server. So even if you do go back to WordPress, the WordPress server that's rendering the page still has the information it needs to complete the checkout. So I have seen, I think the reason they did that came back down to some of what is it called? What's the word? Security with the payment. What is it called? Like where you can't store like credit card details. What am I thinking?
Is it like PIA or
whatever that is?
I know what you're talking about.
PCI compliance or whatever.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, okay.
I think that's what it is. But I think they wanted to avoid some of the challenges with that. If they were to build the checkout page completely on their own, it is possible, I believe. But is it easy? Over time, it'll get easier, I think. Like none of this existed until somebody built it, right? So as we keep building things, it gets easier for everybody. So nobody was doing e-commerce with WP GraphQL 3-4 years ago. Now a lot of people are, and I imagine as we keep experimenting with it, it gets easier for everybody. So.
Yeah. So speaking of kind of like being able to extend WP GraphQL, are there any limitations, or is it just a matter of like somebody having the time to dig in and starting to actually work with it?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of APIs in WP GraphQL. I designed it early on knowing that I'm not going to solve every problem, right? Like, so I built it following the path of other popular WordPress plugins like WooCommerce or Advanced Custom Fields is another popular WordPress plugin. They all they architected their plugins with the idea that other people can come in and hook in, extend the plugins to meet their needs specifically. So I built WP GraphQL that way, saying, hey, I'm going to try and solve some core WordPress problems and try and get you 80% of the way there, but I want you to be able to finalize your projects and get that extra 20%. So everything is pretty extendable. It's, I think, decently documented on WPGraphQL.com. So you can read, I've got like snippets of code in there and recipes and tutorials and stuff. So you can read how to extend the schema for your specific needs. There is a bit of an extension ecosystem. I think there's like 30 plus WP GraphQL extensions now. So you have like WP GraphQL for WooCommerce, WP GraphQL for Advanced Custom Fields. There's Gravity Forms one, which Gravity Forms is a popular WordPress form builder plugin. So there's a company that's maintaining that. There's like an event calendar plugin that Jeff Taylor, the WooCommerce maintainer, the WP GraphQL for WooCommerce maintainer, he created an extension for the events calendar, which is a popular event listing plugin. And the company that maintains the event calendar said, hey, we'll take ownership of the GraphQL extension now. So earlier, I think it was earlier this year, they officially took ownership of the extension. There's an extension for Yoast SEO, which is a popular SEO plugin. So we're seeing a lot of growth, right? Like there's all these plugins out there that do stuff for not headless WordPress. And now we're seeing, hey, like you just install this little bridge plugin and boom, your headless sites can work. Like you can use Yoast with your Gatsby site or your Next site or whatever you want to handle your SEO data. So yeah, there's a lot of extensions. All you got to do is install a bridge plugin or whatever we want to call it. And boom, your WordPress data for that plugin will be exposed to GraphQL. And if it doesn't exist, like go read some code from some of those plugins and, make it exist.
Yeah, I was actually curious, like how the extension part of worked with it from WP GraphQL's perspective, and maybe before we talk about that a little bit, we should step back. I was curious, like,
Sure.
what's WP GraphQL actually doing? Because, like, so I would imagine WordPress has its own database, right, where it's storing all this data, and I would imagine like you're completely bypassing, like, it's not like you're putting a layer in front of the REST API or anything.
No.
Like, how are you actually querying that database directly?
Yeah.
And
So
like we
WordPress
don't need to
has,
get into the
yeah.
weeds, like just high level.
Yeah. WordPress has a lot of like internals for querying data. So like there's what's called a WP query class and a WP user query class. So there's like all these PHP classes to get data. So you're not writing direct SQL queries most of the time. So I'm making use of the existing infrastructure that WordPress has to get this stuff. And but I'm not using the REST API. I don't wrap the REST API for kind of reasons I
Yeah.
touched on earlier. Is like if we wanted to get like a lot of resources in one request, we'd have to hit a lot of endpoints. Even if it is internal in PHP, you end up doing a lot more work than you need to do. So WP GraphQL will use some of these internal mechanisms like WP query to get data. And the way something like WP query works is it actually checks for caches first. So it
Mm.
says, hey, is this object that you're trying to get already in a cache? If so, I can return it from the cache. Otherwise, I'll go to the database. So by using some internal mechanisms, existing plugins that you might be using, like a Redis cache plugin, for example, or a memcache plugin or backcache, like there's all sorts of caching plugins. By
Hmm.
using existing WordPress mechanisms, your other plugins like caching, for example, or whatever, will just work, right? Um,
Right.
so
Interesting.
where if WP GraphQL is talking directly to the database, then like things like caching, like we'd have to reinvent the whole ecosystem around that, where there's already solutions for some of that.
Right.
And so it does talk to the WordPress database, but through existing WordPress mechanisms. And then it also respects like the WordPress authentication authorization layers. So
Mm.
you can do public stuff, right? Like in WordPress, if you publish a post, a lot of your data is public, right? The title of the post is public, the content of the post is public. But if you log into WordPress and you create a draft post that is not published, that's private, right? Like if you're logged into WordPress, you can see it, but a random user visiting your blog, they can't see it. So GraphQL follows that. Like if you're making public GraphQL requests, you can see things like published blog posts without having to be authenticated. But if you're building UI or whatever, a Jamstack UI where you want to be able to edit posts, then you can actually log in with WordPress. So you can. There's a number of ways to do it. You can do like JWT authentication or OAuth or whatever. But
Hmm.
once you're authenticated, you can make authenticated GraphQL requests that says, "Hey, this is who I am, and I'm requesting a list of posts." And now, cool, you can see the draft post included with the published post. So you can see stuff that public users cannot see. And so yeah, you can do all sorts of cool stuff like that with GraphQL. But
That's awesome. I didn't realize you were able to take advantage of so much like core WordPress stuff. I always imagined that you were like, querying the database directly, and I could only imagine that could be a handful. So that's awesome to
yeah,
hear.
yeah, and there's like other registries in WordPress. Like there's a post type registry and a taxonomy registry. So like a lot of plugins will hook into these registries and modify like what data exists. And so I also hook into those registries and listen to, okay, has any plugins registered any custom post types? And if so, I can do like 90% of the work for you and expose it to the schema, and then you can just tweak it from there. Right. So like you can write 2 lines of code that's like register post type books showing GraphQL true, and then boom, you have like you're able to query a list of books. You can query a single book. You can update a book. You can delete a book. You can create a book, like all with GraphQL with like
Yeah.
2 lines of code, or by clicking activate on some plugin that does it for you.
And I think you just answered what my next question was going to be, because I was going to ask, because I realized that I think was it the advanced custom fields, or was it custom post type? One of them, like, you don't need to install a plugin anymore. And it sounds like that's the reason why, because you're able to use those core technologies, right?
Yeah, custom post type UI. I had built a bridge plugin for that. I mean, we're talking, it was like 30 lines of code or something. Basically, a custom post type UI is a plugin that allows you to register post types and taxonomies to WordPress. And so to show a post type or taxonomy in the GraphQL schema, there's just like 3 properties you need to define. And so I wrote a bridge plugin that added those 3 properties to their plugin. And after they got enough usage of it, they're like, hey, this is silly that it's a second plugin. Like, we'll just take that code, bake it into our plugin. And so they took ownership of that. So yeah, you don't need the bridge plugin anymore. They just added the 3 fields to say, hey, do you want this in GraphQL or not? And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, those fields only show if you have both plugins, WPGraphQL and custom post type UI. So if you're using custom post type UI without WPGraphQL, you're not bothered with like the GraphQL fields. But if they're both active together, it says, hey, do you want this to be in GraphQL? And yeah, so and
That's awesome.
I know there's been discussion. The Yoast team, so there's the WP-GraphQL for Yoast extension, and the Yoast team has been discussing the same thing. Like, hey, should we take ownership of this extension so users can? So there is a fork on their GitHub repo, on the Yoast GitHub repo, where they're exploring
interesting
what it might look like to have GraphQL native to their plugin.
Yeah, that's amazing being able to get that buy-in.
Extension. Yeah. So we'll see what happens with that. But yeah, I think over time, as things stabilize more and more, we'll see more ownership from the community of saying, hey, we're getting a lot of users that would rather use GraphQL than REST. How can we play our part in the ecosystem?
Yeah, and I think the extensions, I think WP GraphQL by itself is like super powerful, but I think the extensions help me even more, because part of what I want to do with WordPress when I'm building sites is I want to have the ability to create custom data types like products, and being able to just kind of plug in those plugins, even though I know plugins have a bad history with WordPress, but being able to use those and immediately have that data available by just doing a few things in the admin, that's extremely powerful.
Yeah, I think the way you said about plugins having bad history, I think that's a little blown out of proportion. Like, if it's the quality of plugins that matter, like the number of plugins doesn't matter. If you could have 1,000 well-written plugins, and it's going to work just fine. You could have one poorly written plugin, and it'll blow your site up. So it's really a quality over quantity.
Fair enough.
There. Yeah. But yeah, like a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, there's 1,000 plugins. I think at the newspaper, we had something like, I don't know, 100 plugins, but they were all very specific in what they did. Allowed us to maintain the code base more isolated, right? But they totally get a bad rap than the quantity. Yeah,
that makes sense. So I think the next question, I want to talk about how WP GraphQL kind of relates to actual WordPress core. Like, has there ever been conversations of like bringing WP GraphQL into WordPress core itself? And do you have conversations with the WordPress team?
I haven't formally. I've had, I guess, some informal ones. Like, I'm hesitant for WP GraphQL to go to core for a number of reasons. So there's trade-offs, right? Like if something like WP GraphQL is in WordPress core, then boom, 40% of the world has access to GraphQL, right? Like, pretty cool. Flip side though is like a lot of things that end up in WordPress core, because it's used by 40% of the world, like they stagnate. So a feature makes it to WordPress core, and it's very difficult to iterate on a feature when 40% of the internet is using said feature. And so I'm hesitant. Like, I'm still evolving, right? Like, I haven't like built the perfect GraphQL solution still. I'm 5 years in and I'm still iterating and finding things that, oh shoot, like that was a mistake. Let's correct that mistake. And it's a lot easier for people to opt in to a new version of a plugin than it is for them, to be like, hey, core just broke my thing. And so there's iteration to like stuff I'm doing specifically with the GraphQL schema and whatnot. But GraphQL, the specification is still evolving as well. So there's like new things to GraphQL that may or may not be coming sooner than later, like input unions, for example, which would be a really cool, like there's an RFC for it in the GraphQL spec. When that comes, there's going to be breaking changes to WP GraphQL. If it was in core, you either have to break 40% of the web, or you have like 2 versions that you have to maintain. Like, you could be like, ooh, GraphQL 1, GraphQL 2, but then you have to like maintain both of those. Where if it's plugin, we can keep iterating on it and you can opt into the version that makes sense for your project.
Yeah.
And so I think keeping it a plugin, I think makes more sense. Like it's a button click away or a line of Composer JSON config away from being active in your project.
Mm-hmm.
I think the trade-off is more in favor of leaving it separate than because whatever version of it got merged into core is probably the version that's going to stay. Like there's bugs in the REST API that have been there since 2016 and have not been fixed because it's tricky. It's like you have to identify how many people are using this feature before you can. If it's a breaking change, like you might be breaking 40% of the web if you don't do it carefully.
Yeah, for sure. So that said, like, are there any challenges from not being like in core or at least like super heavily involved in the core?
Yeah, I think one of the the current ecosystem of users tends to be like agencies and whatnot that are building Jamstack sites or even not, whether it's static or not, you're using some JavaScript front end usually. And so that ecosystem is happy with how things are now. The other part of the WordPress ecosystem is plugins that affect the WordPress dashboard. So like the WordPress admin side of things. And those types of plugins typically only try to use core WordPress features, right? If you're building a decoupled front end, you'll install whatever plugin you need for that project, easy. But if you're building a plugin that actually interacts with the WordPress dashboard, you can't, it's hard to build something that's like, hey, you need to install these 3 plugins first before this plugin that you just bought can work. And so that part of the WordPress ecosystem could, I think, build some really cool admin UIs using GraphQL and mutations and things like that. But they're largely not interested in investing because it would require them to tell their clients, hey, I built this really cool plugin, but to use it, you have to go install this other thing. And for a lot of people, they're like, well, I'll just use something else. I'll use the REST API or I'll use Ajax, which WordPress has mechanisms for. And so that part of the ecosystem, I think we're missing out on by it not being in core. I think there could be some really awesome like UIs being built that GraphQL could help make easier.
And you can't do any kind of like dependency, like those plugins can't have a dependency.
Not easily.
That doesn't impact the user.
It's not easy. It's not easily because like if you had 2 WordPress plugins, it's not like JavaScript where there's some build step in between that can tell you about these conflicts. It's live code, right? Every request to WordPress is a live request. There's not a build step like there is with JavaScript. So if you had plugin A that needed WPGraphQL 1.0 and a feature of 1.0, and then you had plugin B that needed WPGraphQL 1.6, which had some breaking change or whatever, then all of a sudden like, shoot, plugin A can't work with plugin B. Now you have 2 versions of GraphQL, which one should load when you hit the GraphQL endpoint. Like it gets really, really tricky.
That's a good point.
There might be ways to do it. And if somebody who's like explored that, wants to figure it out and propose something, like that'd be interesting. I think the nature of GraphQL though being one endpoint, having multiple versions at the same time makes it extremely difficult to resolve that. Like the only way I can think of it is you'd have to have like namespaced endpoints where you're like GraphQL v1, GraphQL v2, GraphQL v1.6, but like that gets out of hand, right? Like you can't build client applications that are like, well, if this condition is met, talk to endpoint A, otherwise talk to endpoint B or endpoint. Like your code is going to get so out of hand and maintained. So
yeah, I don't think the plugin ecosystem is meant for dependency management, but that's a great point.
Yeah.
Cool. So do you have anything else that you wanted to add before we I think there's a couple questions I saw in there. Anything that you wanted to add? Anything interesting?
I don't think so. Okay. Yeah, we could take some questions.
Cool. So the first thing, it looks like you're getting a lot of love for using the Jason for your name. So applause to that. And plus your background is on brand. So I appreciate that. Yeah. So we have one question from Venkata. Are there is there anything to keep in mind while retrieving posts that are in Gutenberg? And if I'm not mistaken, you can't get Gutenberg blocks right now, right?
Out of the box, you can't. I've written a lengthy blog post earlier this year on WPGraphQL.com. You can go to the blog, and there's a pretty long blog post I wrote about Gutenberg. Out of the box, WPGraphQL doesn't support it. A big part of that is that the Gutenberg was built as a fully JavaScript application with very little information on the WordPress server. So as far as the WordPress server is concerned, there's almost no knowledge about Gutenberg blocks. It's all JavaScript. And so using an API like the REST API or GraphQL or WP CLI, which is a server API, or XML RPC, which is another built-in API, all of these APIs don't really know what blocks are. They'd have to like load up and execute JavaScript to understand what a block is. And then there's like all sorts of other context around that. So I try to explain this in this blog post that I wrote, so you can go read more about that. Out of the box, no, you can't interact with Gutenberg currently.
Interesting.
You can get content published from Gutenberg as the final HTML version of it. Like I do this with WPGraphQL.com. I write all my posts in Gutenberg today, and my front end is a Gatsby site. And I kind of explain this approach in that blog post too. Like I query all the content as HTML, and then I do some HTML parsing in Gatsby to do some dynamic stuff. Like I have code snippets, for example. So I just look for like a class in the DOM element, and I convert anything with that class to a fancy highlighted code where you can copy the code and stuff, right? So that's one approach to it. I think it works for some portion of the market. Like if you're the agency or the developer that's working on the back end, the WordPress side of things, and the front end, that might work for you because you know what to expect on the back end and the front end. If you're a larger team like the newspaper I was at, where you have different teams working on consuming data and different teams working on the publisher experience, might not work as well because you'd have to write very defensive code on the consumer side because you don't know what to expect. The team managing WordPress could like surprise you, like here's markup you didn't know was coming your way,
right?
And all of a sudden your client is breaking because you didn't know what to expect. So that's that. It can work for some set of the ecosystem. It can also break your stuff, and I wouldn't bank on using the DOM as your API, but
right.
Especially like you already chose React, right? You're trying to get away from that in the first place, so or Vue or whatever it is. So there's trade-offs to it, but I explained that in that blog post. There's ways to do it today. I know Kellen Mace published a video on WP Engine Decode YouTube about Gutenberg. I'm talking with him actually later today about Gutenberg on the Decode podcast.
And I saw Kellen's in here. Kellen, if you have that link, feel free to share it in the chat.
Yeah,
I shared your blog post from WP GraphQL. Hopefully I got the right one.
Cool. Yeah, I think that looks like the right one. So
cool.
Yeah, anyway, we do have some ideas though that we are exploring. There has been some progress from the Gutenberg core team on bringing some data about blocks to the server side. So there's progress, but and you can do stuff today. There is a WP GraphQL for Gutenberg extension, which I talk about in the blog post. It can work for some people. But it might not work for everybody. So
yeah, I myself have kind of gone down that parsing route where I've been using Rehype, and I'm actually in progress of writing a tutorial about it. But what I'm currently doing on my site is I'm using it to produce IDs, so I can create a table of content, so I can just jam that up at the top. But it's definitely like a manual process to get all that work done, but it does end up providing you more flexibility once you can get in that mindset.
Yeah, I do similar things too, like on WPGraphQL.com. Like I think even if you go to the blog post that you shared, like on the right side, I have a table of contents too, so you can kind of go through the headings. And that's all done client side, right? I get the HTML from WPGraphQL, and then I parse it in Gatsby and build these cool things on the client.
Yeah. Awesome. So I don't know if this one's actually a question, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on it. Using a mutation for add to cart but keep running into CORS issues blocked with fetch. They're using a CORS plugin as well. That's a challenge. I don't know if there's any context you have to that. If not, we can.
I mean, I'd probably recommend hopping in the WP-GraphQL Slack. We have a WooCommerce channel in there, so if you're running into issues, I think both of those plugins, the WooCommerce and the CORS plugin, are both maintained by Jeff Taylor, who's pretty active in the Slack there. So I would hop in there and ask some questions in there. I personally haven't really run into many issues with CORS. I know some people do. Maybe I'm just like lucky with the setups I've been using, and I don't know. Maybe I'm not doing some weird things, but I don't have an e-commerce site running with WP GraphQL that I maintain personally. I've just play with that set of stuff.
Yeah.
So
WooCommerce seems like it's a whole other world. I tried to briefly like poke around, and it's just I don't know. It's a lot.
Yeah,
but it seems super powerful. So we also have some love from Alex Trost that all the different plugins with WP GraphQL were super easy to set up. That's always nice to hear. Let's see. Yeah, so Sean, I just pulled up the question about that. And as a new dev, we built our custom, here, let me pull this up. As new devs, we built our custom themes, WP and WooCommerce site on WordPress engine. Would love to move the headless WP to WooCommerce, but would require rewriting a tons of WooCommerce API stuff.
So we talked about this a little bit earlier. I don't know if they relate, but there's WP GraphQL for WooCommerce extension that does a lot of that bridging of WooCommerce data into WP GraphQL. And there's production sites running on it, like we shared earlier. Rudis.com, RUDIS.com is one of those sites that is running in production. There's a number of other ones. That's just one that comes to mind.
So there should be a little bit of work swapping out the request, but the data should primarily be the same.
Yeah, it would be largely the same. Yeah, you'd have to, your client side stuff obviously would have to change, because instead of talking to the REST API or whatever, you talk to WP GraphQL. But if you're doing if you have a lot of like WooCommerce extensions, you might have to do some work there to like expose data in certain ways that maybe aren't exposed out of the box.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think that's it with the questions, unless anybody chimes in with the last one. So Jason, I want to thank you so much for popping on here. Did you have anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I guess just where you can find me. I'm on Twitter at Jason Bahl, JASON, BAHL. And then also at WP GraphQL. They're both just me. Usually trolling myself. And then on YouTube, WP GraphQL has a channel. I'm not like extremely active on there, but there are some videos on there. WPGraphQL.com. And then github.com/WP-GraphQL. There is also a pretty active Slack community. We've got a few thousand people in the WP GraphQL Slack, pretty active, helping each other solve all sorts of cool problems. And there's a link in the GitHub repo where you can join that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks again for hopping on. If you want to learn more about WP GraphQL and Jason, make sure you go follow him on Twitter and head over to WPGraphQL.com. And you can also check out my new course, E-commerce on the Jamstack, available at Level Up Tutorials, where I walk you through building an online store using Next.js, headless WordPress, including WP GraphQL, and a ton of other awesome tools. So Jason, any last words?
I think we're good.
Cool. All right. Well, this is Colby signing off. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.